Today, our author and co-editor of the book we are going to discuss is Federico Savini, who is an associate professor in environmental planning, institutions and politics, which is quite a label, actually, at the University of Amsterdam. He comes actually from sociology, and we know each other quite since a long time, from Urbino times, Italy, where there is also a painting, The Ideal City, by the way, which might be an interesting incipit for many planners, how to plan cities. He moved towards more spatial sensitive approaches and combines actually political sociology perspectives with urban planning and critical geography to the study of institutions and social spatial change in cities, which is a very good and very interesting disciplinary combination, actually. And my assumption is current issues and problems require multiple disciplines to be even understood and conceived in a proper way. So I think it's a very nice combination. In his works, he studies the politics that drive institutional change and also how institutions can learn from errors, hopefully, at some point, and focusing on different sets of regulations that shape the working of city regions and their ecological impact on the planet. And in particular, he uses a degrowth perspective, about which we will talk today on spatial planning, which is also the topic of the book, indeed. And the title of the book is Post-Growth Planning, Cities Beyond the Market Economy, a book that he edited together with a few colleagues, Antonio Ferreira and Yvonne von Schoenfeld, for Routledge last year, 2022. And he's part of a community of degrowth scholars in Europe and in the Netherlands, and coordinator and curator of a master studio, Future Cities, where I had also the pleasure to talk at some point, I think 2 years ago, more or less. That takes place in Amsterdam every year, actually, in January, and which is a core part of a master in urban planning at the University of Amsterdam. We have also a few discussants also this time, and I have a pleasure to introduce you to Yvonne. I don't know how you pronounce it, Rydin or Rydin or?
The English version is Rydin. It's Swedish, Rydin. It's Rydin, but Rydin is what most people say.
Okay. And Elisabetta Mocca. Yvonne holds a chair of Planning, Environment and Public Policy at the Bartlett School of Planning at the Faculty of the Built Environment at UCL in London, UK. And she's actually a specialist in governing for sustainability, which is a topic she has researched and published on very widely. And more recently, she has been also exploring the contribution of social technical studies to the understanding of governing sustainability, with reference to major energy infrastructures, and etc. And she's also an author of this book, which is actually weird to have her as a discussant, but actually we asked to be a discussant also because she published another relevant book, which is relevant to this series, which is titled Regulation and Planning, Practices, Institutions and Agency, which she edited actually with Bob Beauregard, who is an old friend, Marco Cremaschi from Sciences Po. I think, no, Bob Beauregard didn't retire because they never retire in the US. He's at Columbia. He took on the chair of Susan Feinstein when she moved to Harvard. And also Laura Lieto is one of the co-editors of this book for Routledge. Our second discussant is Elisabetta Mocca, who is currently a Maria Hoder Fellow at the University of Vienna, where she also worked as a postdoc for some years in the previous years. She's also working on degrowth, but not only. She's working on local urban policies. We co-edited together actually the Handbook of Urban Social Policies for Edward Elgar, which has been published last year. And also she is the author of a book which is forthcoming for the summer, actually just a few days after the beginning of the summer, hopefully, and which we will be discussing next year. And the title is Cities in Search of Freedom, European Municipalities Against the Leviathan. And you can imagine who the Leviathan might be. She published it for Policy Press. So I stop here my introduction. I see that many more people joined. And I give the floor to Federico for his presentation and thank him and the discussant very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Yuri, very much for the very kind introduction and the invitation to join this series. I'm honored actually to be part of this series. And I know in the last years you've been inviting great authors, writing masterpieces. So I'm really happy to be able to present this book here, which is here. It does exist. And of course, I'm doing this also on behalf of Antonio Ferreira and Kim Carlotta from Schofield. They both work in Portugal. And they were, the partner in crimes in this book. Now, I will introduce a bit the topic behind the book and then also discuss some of the key insights of the book. I will touch upon some of the chapters, not all of them, and hopefully it will be enough to convince you to read the whole volume. Now, the reason why we wrote this book is that about 4 years ago, when we met, in fact, during the master studio that Yuri mentioned, I organized the studio about degrowth and cities, and then we realized that planners were big missing voices in the degrowth debate, which was mostly addressing degrowth economics, so environmental economics. There were some anthropologists, of course, sociologists, a lot of activists, but actually spatial planners were quite absent in the debate. So we decided to collect the people that we thought were the most, let's say, engaged with these terms in the debate. We asked all of them to join this project, and they all said yes. And in fact, it came out very nicely, a book that is really intergenerational. There are some planners which have a lot of experience with others that are just upcoming in the research field in planning. And we had also planners that came from other disciplines, geography and sociology, and others which came from architecture. So in fact, it came up to be quite in this interdisciplinary book. So while the title clearly puts planning at the center, we also read this book as a contribution in the field of geography and urban studies at large. So in case you're wondering whether it's just for planners. Anyway, so let me start. The title of the book is indeed Post-Growth Planning, Cities Beyond the Market Economy. And now here I want immediately to put some things clear. So I will talk from now on about degrowth, more specifically, not post-growth. Now, the reason why we distinguish between these two terms is quite simple. When we, of course, talk about degrowth, we are within a post-growth thinking stream or approach. A post-growth approach is identifiable by rejecting three key myths of current sustainability, mainstream sustainability economics. The first is that economic growth is good for society and personal well-being in general. That's the first myth that we reject by addressing a post-growth thinking approach. The second is that economic growth can be decoupled from environmental degradation. And the third is that economic growth is actually necessary to achieve climate targets. So when we reject these three statements, we are already operating within a post-growth theme. Yet, when we talk about degrowth, we do a step further. So degrowth is actually a much more concrete project of a socio-political transformation oriented to do two things. The first, obviously, is a planned downscaling of all activities that are environmentally harmful and socially alienating, starting from those that are considered less necessary for the well-being of humans and the environment. Now, the key words here are also planned. The fact is the downscaling that is planned is not a recession, it's not a downscaling of the economy out of control. But also the other key word is that it tackles particularly those forms of production and consumption that are considered as less necessary for the well-being. However, degrowth is not only a project of downscaling, it's also a project of increasing and improvement. In fact, it can also be defined as a planned increase of all activities that regenerate the ecosystem and improve social well-being, starting from the fulfilling of basic needs. Now, this becomes clear that degrowth is a project of improving all those living standards by those communities and groups that do not meet today basic human lives. In sum, degrowth is a project of taking out from excess by downscaling overall economic output, by bringing back in where there is a shortfall in what we call a well-being or a foundational economy. Those activities that are essential for human lives and that today are scarce or let's say are not enough for particular groups of society. That's why degrowth is a project of social and ecological justice. Now, it is important to talk about degrowth nowadays because of the current trends in environmental degradation. Now, this simple image shows you the relation between economic growth, understood in GDP, in gross domestic product increase worldwide, the global CO2 emissions, and the global material footprint. Now, when we talk about degrowth as an alternative, and we reject, as I said, the myth that economic growth can be decoupled from environmental degradation, we take this evidence as a base. What we know is that historically, there is no proof whatsoever of what economists call absolute decoupling of CO2 emissions from GDP. So basically a decrease in CO2 emission simultaneous to an increase in GDP. We do have a proof of a relative decoupling, which is what we see here. So a smaller increase of CO2 emission relative to the same increase of GDP. However, for urban scholars, it's even more important to take the material footprint in consideration. Here we see that historically our economy and our society has achieved no whatsoever capacity to even relatively decoupling material footprint from GDP. Material footprints basically means all the stuff, all the materials, commodities, substances that we extract from the environment in order to fuel our economies. Now, this image shows how the target that we are setting up actually relatively to that reality. The latest IPCC report, which was epitomized by the UN chief Antonio Guterres, A Highway to Climate Hell, shows very well that the reality it's very far from what is necessary to halt climate and biodiversity breakdown. We see, in fact, that today there is almost no chance to reach even a downscaling that would allow to be within 2 degrees Celsius, which climate scientists obviously point out as a catastrophic increase in temperature within our planetary system. Now, degrowth comes into the picture because the current mainstream approaches to sustainability are not delivering at the speed and scale necessary to meet those climate targets. Now, the speed and scale is essential. We are looking for solutions that rapidly and massively can downscale CO2 emission, let alone the material footprint of our economy. And at the moment, the current mainstream approaches are not delivering in scale and speed. In fact, at the moment, they look more like wishful thinking, especially if we go into the field of geoengineering, for example, or CO2 capturing, et cetera, et cetera. Now, degrowth is a project of socio-ecological justice, and this comes to the picture whenever we talk about the historical responsibility to this image of material footprint and CO2 emission that I showed. Now, recent studies have showed clearly that not everybody is equally responsible for environmental destruction. Globally, the richest 10% of the incomes actually emit 50% of all the CO2 worldwide, while the poorer 50% emits 10% of the CO2 emissions. Now, this is a global image, so obviously it contains a difference between global north and the global south. However, if we take a more regionalized or a more precise image, we see that the disparity is still existing. This is the most recent study published by the team the team of Piketty in France, which actually shows the historical emissions by income level in different continents. Let's take Europe just to give an example. In Europe, you see that the top 10% incomes are responsible for actually 5 times more, 6 times more the emissions of the bottom 50%. Actually, this disparity is similar to actually, for example, East Asia. There as well, we see in fact that the bottom 50% incomes are already actually matching the target in CO2 emissions yearly. The IPCC argues, in fact, that we should strive for about 2 to 3 tons of CO2 emissions per year. Well, this means that it is the higher incomes that need to downscale the most. And that's why degrowth is a project of reducing excess, starting where the excess is accumulating. The right image gives you also even more insight, in fact, historically. We see, in fact, that the largest contribution in increases CO2 emissions, it's concentrated in the top 1% actually of the incomes historically. While actually, if we take the middle incomes, the middle class, let's put it this way, the high middle class, we see already some sort of decrease in CO2 emissions. This is due, of course, to the popularization of more sustainable types of lifestyles that we know are gaining momentum within particular types of income groups, the middle high income groups. Now, these two images shows that when we talk about degrowth, we're talking about degrowth of the rich. We're talking about this downscaling of excess consumption and excess wealth in order to actually bring back the economy into planetary boundaries. This is a very important thing to keep in mind. Now, as you remember, post-growth thinking also says that GDP growth is not, rejects the myth that GDP growth is generally necessary for improved well-being, both collective and individual. Well, these studies, more and more studies show, in fact, that an increase in GDP, so in economic output of countries, in this case, does not translate automatically to an increase in life satisfaction as a whole. In fact, what we see in the image on the left is what is generally known as the Easterling paradox. Basically, is that life quality increases up to a certain point of GDP increase, but after that point, we see that there is no added value in increasing of GDP. The same graph, I don't have it here, but I can tell you it's in another presentation. The same graph can be done in terms of material stock per the economy. We know that countries with large material stocks, for example, Germany, that has a big mining industry, does not deliver in terms of higher life quality. In fact, in this image, we see that the GDP of the United States, while being much higher than the one of Puerto Rico, it's actually not, does not deliver a much higher life quality. Actually, this is rather obvious, but if we ask people what they value the most in their life, they are usually stressing, partner or family or friend relationships, health, not work or consumption. Now, this sounds obvious, but actually, the idea that consuming and producing more is necessary for being happier is ingrained deeply in our culture, and has reached some sort of hegemonic status. Now, the same type of studies are being done also at the level of cities. As you know, Amsterdam is one of the first cities in Europe that has adopted the donut economics framework of Kate Raworth. I'm not going to explain. I can do it later if you want. You can ask me about that. But by adopting that framework, they actually assessed what type of social return the economic success of the city has brought to people living in Amsterdam. This graph shows, in fact, that in the last 20 years, in the last 10 years, sorry, the indicators relating to work and income have generally improved. In Amsterdam, there is a booming economy. Yet, the indicators that have been decreasing are the ones related to, in fact, personal well-being and health, mental health, loneliness, which is becoming a silent, what people here call a silent epidemic, commuting time. So in fact, we see that there is a lot of, there is a dark side of economic growth, especially when applied to the daily life of cities. Now, as I said, this is a bit the story that environmental economics have been telling for years now about degrowth and why it is necessary. But yet urban studies have been coming a bit late in the debate. Now, it is a bit surprising because cities are the engines of economic growth today. Actually, already, John Logan and Harvey Mollich, colleagues of URI that we know well, already in the 80s, identified cities as growth machines. At that time, the main commodity was real estate and financial assets. They were driving national economies. In fact, the results of these 30 years of urbanized economic growth is that cities today are the highest concentration of wealth, but also with this wealth comes the highest concentration of materials, in fact, and environmental degradation. In fact, the cities covers 2% of the planet's surface, but actually consume almost 80, in fact, percent of all materials in the economy. In fact, cities are like sponges. They attract water, energy, heat, stuff, materials to them, and they keep them as a stock and spit them back as a form of waste. All of this has been defined as the phenomenon of a planetary urbanization, where we have basically an extended hinterland globally that is working just for cities to survive. But also what we see is that the wealth and material stock is concentrated in some of cities. Just actually 600 cities owns 2/3 of the old global wealth. So there are some particular cities that are actually the motor of the global economies. And of course, real estate is the top third, the top three, it's in the top three commodities of investments. Now, the first two are, of course, energy, but also we have culture and art as top commodities for large capitals. Now, what I'm just saying here is that cities have been always praised as economic growth, motors of economic growth. However, by doing that, this type of policies have somehow pushed out, as I will explain in a second, the problems of economic growth and made them invisible to both urban policymakers and urban scholars. The paradox of this is that it's pretty easy to find today cities where CO2 emissions are decreasing. So there are many European cities where CO2 emissions are decreasing, yet, and air quality is improving. Yet we see that these CO2 emissions, so Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions, are being displaced elsewhere. The same works with the so-called domestic material consumption of cities. Domestic material consumption of cities is in Europe decreasing. So there is less and less consumption of materials within cities. But if we take material footprint, we see that the value chain of the built environment is globalizing and is not decreasing. So this means that urban scholars have a large, I think, today responsibility to tackle urban growth in order to address climate and biodiversity breakdown. Planning, most of all, has this responsibility. And why is because I think so far it has played quite a contradictory role. I also define this role a bit schizophrenic, in fact, because on the one hand, planners have been the advocates for urban growth. They have devised procedures, models, approaches to regional growth. Think about agglomeration economies in the 80s that were particularly geared to attract capital in cities in order to generate also, according to the idea of growth-based development, also to generate the condition for sustainable development. In the slide before, I showed the book by Edward Glaser, which probably among the many is one of the most clear examples of how this urban thinking has obsessed planners that were concerned with sustainability. There, the idea is that the success of cities is necessary to actually achieve climate targets, because it's within cities that we get creative ideas for the environment and for sustainable development. So planners have became actually advocates of growth or green growth today. On the other hand, planners are good people. They also know that this economic growth had clear social and ecological damages, and they try to put in place all kinds of devices and tools that would compensate for it. Now, the so-called value capturing mechanism, the solidarity funds, qualitative standards, green space, parking space reduction, public transportation, sport facilities, green belts, green fingers. I can mention many of these tools that planners basically put in place in order to compensate for the negative effect of this economic growth. However, my argument, and that's the argument at the beginning of the book, is that planners, by doing that, are basically digging a hole in the water. They're trying to compensate for a process that it has its own compulsion to grow, and a system that will eventually always worsen the problems that we're trying to solve. It's a lost battle, I think. And at this stage, especially if we take speed and scale in consideration, we see that very clearly. Now, why is the lost battle? Let's take sustainability, mainstream sustainability approaches to planning. Well, there are three limitations that we can identify. The first is what we can call cost shifting. This example of cost shifting, as I mentioned before, it's the case when we, for example, electrify mobility within cities. In doing so, we reduce CO2 emissions and pollution. But by doing that, we increase the amount of lithium and coltan that is necessary for batteries. We also increase all kinds of products that are necessary for the digitalized economy of cities to thrive. And by doing that, we increase the impact of that economy outside of cities, like e-waste dumps, as you see there. Example of cost shifting is the fact that today lithium is next to sand, in fact, is one of the most wanted commodities on Earth. We know that by 2030, there will be a 42% of demand of lithium. Also, the paradox of this is that by growing continuously the demand of energy, also the electrification is some sort of dog chasing its tail. We know, for example, that if we cover the whole surface of cities with solar panels, we will be able to fuel only 2% of their energy necessary, of the energy necessary for their functioning. Now, this is an example of cost shifting, which, by the way, is the chapter number 1 of the book by Giacomo D'Alisa and Marta Conde and Filka Sekulova. You can find it in the book where we explain what this cost shifting is. Now, another example of the limitation of current mainstream approaches is land use. So it is very common to hear planners, policymakers saying that the sustainable energy will save cities. And in fact, there is nothing wrong with sustainable energy, of course. You will never hear me saying that it's bad. We need to completely move to green energy. That's a priority. However, the degrowth argument is that we will never succeed to do that if our energy demand increases. Even more so if renewable energy is something that consumes large amounts of land. In this graph on the left, you see, in fact, that the onshore wind, that's the bottom one, is the one that consumes per megawatt hour the largest amount of land. We're talking about 250 square meters of land per megawatt hour provided. Solar, if it's installed on roof, is actually very efficient, as we know, but that will be enough just to cover 2% of our city's energy demand. Yet, if we take most of the energy of the solar power, of solar energy produced today, we see that is installed on ground, and this is leading massive land use consumption. So again, I'm not claiming that electrification and renewable energy are not good. They are extremely important, but we need to frame them within a project of downscaling energy demand and material demand of cities. The last example of the failure, or let's say limitation of mainstream sustainability policies, when coupled to economic growth, is what we can label as eco-gentrification. These are just two of the most famous examples of cases in which greening, understood here as literally putting green on buildings, it becomes possible only in light of an increase of value in real estate, which has an obvious negative effect on the displacement of communities within central areas of cities. The paradox of this approach is that the greenest part of cities are the most wealthy. And this is an approach also that degrowth clearly questions, because it is a project of socio-ecological justice. In fact, for degrowth, putting trees on buildings is definitely not the urgency, not the priority, rather to downscale the amount of materials and space used for buildings. Some examples will come in a second. So just to summarize so far, a post-grow approach to planning, or a degrow approach to planning, I would frame it, means to downscale, slow down, and close the metabolism of cities. So these are three key words. To downscale, reduce the amount of materials, energy in cities, coming in cities. To slow down, so to maintain the stock as long as possible. And also to close the material loop. So involving with truly social circular economies in cities. This is a bit the agenda that I'm actually dealing now in my research. This means actually also to pursue well-being directly in cities and not as a proxy of economic growth. This is basically the opposite of trickle-down economics. We need an agenda of well-being and equality in cities that is completely independent from economic growth. We need to decouple economic growth from well-being. It means also to address increasing life quality where there is not enough by redistributing where there is too much consumption and wealth. It is a redistribution process that allows to improve conditions of those groups that are not meeting basic needs. It is also a process of democratizing the process of production of the built environment. Now, here also the important thing for degrowth is that democracy comes with slowing down. Actually, the lack of democracy is a symptom of the fact that we try to accelerate urban transformation. So democratic decision-making is also a process to not only make it more just, but also to slow it down. And of course, this means to invest in all those activities that are extremely fundamental for the well-being of individuals, but at the same time have a low environmental impact. This is the economy of health, care, education, culture. This is an economy that is truly sustainable. Now, what we did in this book is to unpack some of the key sectors that we think are important in dealing with this agenda. The key sectors are not exhaustive. We know that there are some missing, and we are very aware of it. They are the sectors of dwelling and living, moving, of course, mobility. We dealt with the issue of governance and the scale organization of the state. Regulations, one of the key tools for planners, the production of food and nature in cities, and eventually we also ended up thinking in terms of mentality of planning. Now, let me give you a snapshot of each of this briefly by quoting some of the chapters of the book. The section on dwelling has two chapters, one by me and Dan Boshout, colleague from the University of Utrecht, one from Anitra Nelson and Paul Chatterton. These chapters deal with the issue of housing cooperatives. Now, there's nothing wrong with social housing, of course. We are a big fan of social housing. We all agree about it. However, from a degrowth perspective, which is trying to generate autonomy from the state, collaborative and cooperative housing is an avenue of research and practice that needs to be more explored. The reason, simply put, is that it is a form of organizing housing around conviviality and cooperation that the state housing has not yet provided, at least not in the recent decades. The reason why we're dealing with cooperative housing is because of this primarily, because here we can couple social targets, so affordability targets, with targets of convivial living, sufficiency living, which are developing new forms of lifestyle, which are building new forms of lifestyle and living, which are low impact. Now, the case of the New Emeint in Amsterdam is used as a small-scale case of sufficiency living. There are 50 residents, but also Anitra Nelson and Paul Chatterton bring in cases that are much larger from Switzerland, like the Kalkbreite in Zurich, a project that involved 250 residents, is a limited equity cooperative that is working very well. And today in Switzerland, we have quite a large sector of the housing stock owned by cooperatives. This is a way to, interrupt the cycle of financialization of housing in a way to keep housing prices at levels of affordability despite economic growth. The second section of the book deals with transport and mobility. Here we have two contributions by Luca Bertolini and Anna Nicolaeva, two colleagues at my department, and another contribution by Antonio and Kim, the two co-editors of the book. What we do there, we deal with localism. And in that section, there is, in fact, the statement that the current mobility systems are mostly based on very simplistic idea of how people move, people and things move. These ideas are mostly oriented to, indeed, maximizing economic value and time and increasing efficiency. The paradox of this system is that we're actually producing more and more supply of efficient and rapid mobility, and at the same time increasing the demand itself with consequent environmental degradation. So in this graph, for example, Antonio and Kim bringing a different perspective and says we need to reshift the focus from a perspective on mobility that dismisses economic value and puts well-being at the center. That's what they call degrowth and commoning. That includes also disorder and complexity. So they claim for some more rebel and participatory form of mobility planning. This is a way basically to look at mobility at the city from an anti-economic perspective that we know today is extremely urgent to bring back the well-being. You can think about the 15-minute city in Paris as one of the key concepts nowadays that's trying to actually bring this, non-economistic, non-econometric understanding of mobility back to cities. The chapter on governance or governing deals with the city as a commons. In this chapter, we have two scholars, which are not planners, in fact, Massimo De Angelis, which is a political scientist or geographer, and Giuseppe Micciarelli, which is a lawyer. They bring in a perspective on the commons, dealing on how to govern urban space as a commons. The argument there is that the current economic growth system of planning is extremely focused on production and consumption as key activities for cities. The shift that is necessary is instead to move from a production consumption focus to a social reproduction focus. The degrowth argument is in fact that our current focus or obsession with growth has made invisible all that invisible work of care, education that is performed by women, by migrants, by elderly, by children, all that work of social reproduction that in fact keeps our economy going. We need to bring that back, that work of social reproduction in the picture of urban policymaking and organize governance based on that. So this graph just shows, I'm not going to explain it too much, but it just shows a snapshot of how, in fact, a city governance could be organized bottom-up, building on services that are essential, like education, healthcare, and environmental things like green space or regenerative agriculture. What we do now is the opposite. Cities are governed by boards that are economic boards, they are international boards, they are competitive global competition boards, real estate development boards. They are all kind of bodies that are governing cities that are oriented to production and consumption, not social reproduction. The section on regulations bring back the key tool of planners. And here we have two contributions, one by Yvonne Rydin, in fact, which is here today with us, and Jean Xue, which is another quite prominent planning scholar in degrowth debate. And Xue brings in fact, I'm not talking about Yvonne's work because she might talk about it, she's here. Of course, she deals with the regional systemic challenges of growth-led planning and how we can deal with them. Xing Shui brings back the image or like the question of the state and the regulations that can promote post-growth principles. She lists some of these principles that regard both outcome and process. Her argument, I think, is extremely important. He says that in planning, we've become obsessed with process instead of outcome. And this obsession with process has somehow blinded planning from the actual social and environmental consequences of the decisions on the environment. Somehow we achieved participation and advocacy. We succeeded in that in many cases, but we did not understand the related side effect of those same decisions on the broad environmental conditions of cities. This is an example of cost shifting, what I defined before. I think of this list, the most interesting maybe to point out is what she defined as a certain level of power centralization. Maybe Elisabetta has something to say about it, because in fact, Jean and Antonio and other scholars are clear promoters of state planning, arguing in fact that the cities alone cannot achieve a degrowth agenda. It's simply because this cost shifting is become structural and they do not have the tools and responsibility to deal with the hinterland, everything that is beyond that. So in fact, there is some sort of underlying claim that the state needs to needs to be brought back into the picture. The chapter on nurturing, as I said, deals with food production, one of the main consumed goods in cities. Here, the argument is that our current grow-led planning system has somehow divided clearly rural from urban spaces. In fact, this division is essential also for us, urbanized people living in cities, to somehow forget or deny the effects of our lifestyles on the hinterlands of the globe. Now, the argument here is that we need to rethink this urban-centric approach from the inside out and put back the places of production of food and materials into the picture of planning. So we can do that at different scales. The chapter by Giuseppe Feiola and Giulia Spaniard, colleagues at Utrecht University, clearly shows examples of where planning is completely driven by agroecological principles at the regional level. They bring the example of the Territorios Campesinos Agroalimentarios in Colombia, and but also the chapter by Sara Esbay and Beatriz Pineda Revilla brings back the cultural and value of growing food within cities. So bringing back the culture of regenerative agroecology within urban spaces. Now, these are just two examples of many cases of degrowth-oriented urban policymaking. The last two chapters of the book deal with the key questions of planners' worldview. Now, one of the most common critiques to degrowth arguments in planning by planners is we can never do that. We cannot do that because we do need the revenues from growth in order to provide for social housing, for green spaces, for schools, for public transports, etc., etc. If we arrest that process, we will undermine the very possibility of cities to actually pay for those social services. Now, what Christian Lamker, Viola Schulz-Teichholz, and also Leonie Sandercock did was to question this view. They said, well, actually already shifting the mindset of planners by putting at the center well-being and community and places would already be a step further into this transition. And in fact, Christian and Viola, they actually surveyed many planners. They asked them what they think about degrowth. And they saw that there were some of these planners that were already having some sort of degrowth inclination within them. That's what they defined as medium to high or high potential for change. So planners that were motivated within public administrations to embrace post-growth principles. And I have to say, we see this happening more and more in planning administrations, also in the city where I live, in Amsterdam. Yes, this was a quick glance of the book, of different chapters. The book concludes with a glossary of terms, which we hope would be useful also for students. And he also concludes with a manifesto that I'm using at the moment to build up a network of post-growth urban scholars and activists. Now, if you want to read more about this topic, I invite you also to look at 2 articles that are from my side that are published recently. They are written there. And of course, all the authors of the book have also written massively, extensively on degrowth and post-growth. So I really invite you to look at the work by these authors in the book. If you, after reading the book, you think it's not enough and you're craving for more. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward very much to your questions or critique or opinions about this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Federico, for this insightful presentation, which balanced very nicely analytical dimensions, values, normative standpoints of view, and also facts and inputs which substantiate your arguments. I really valued that very much. It was very clear, and I think the debate will be very interesting afterwards. I would give the floor first to Yvonne and then to Elisabetta for their comments. Then you might respond to these comments, and then we open up the floor for a Q&A session. So Yvonne, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Federico, for your, as usual, spot-on presentation. I would also like to say how much I appreciated the process by which the book was produced. Federico and his co-editors ran a number of online workshops, which were incredibly interesting, very well organized and really interactive. And it was in the middle of the pandemic, so they were an absolute godsend. I think that's reflected in the nature of the book, which is a little unusual in its type. It's not a typical academic book in its structure. I position myself more in terms of post-growth and the importance of the debates about post-growth. And what I really appreciate about this is that it's taking the idea of planning and it's opening it up to new kind of possibilities. That's really important because urban planning has increasingly moved away from a public sector-led process of creating and managing change in both built and natural environments towards a market-led process. Profitability, asset value, shareholder return are the key drivers, and any broader community benefit is dependent on those financial returns. To challenge that, we really need a search for a new form of planning, and I think post-growth is a fresh way of asking those questions rather than just trying to go back to some post-World War II consensus. Certainly we find that tighter regulation can shape new developments at the margin and secure a greater scale of community benefit or planning gain, but there are clear limits. These are limits to the kinds of developments that could be promoted, to the extent of the planning gain, and in particular, the point that Federico has really drawn our attention to, the scale of new development promoted by market-led planning continues to consume resources and produce pollution at an unsustainable rate. So what I'm particularly interested in is opening up these debates about what planning can be like, and also thinking about, in a sense, the practices and policies of planning. The question I always have in the back of my mind is, how can we make it work? Post-growth planning, and the thinking around it, tries to combine 2 things. One is to reduce the rate of increase in economic activity, as Federico emphasized. That is to not reduce economic activity per se, but to actually reduce the rate of increase in that economic activity. And alongside that, to look for alternative dynamics whereby goods and services can be produced and distributed. In neoliberal times, it seems that the public sector is no longer the go-to alternative to the market. And so this has increased attention and interest in commoning to fulfill these functions. And many of the chapters in the book do talk about commoning in a variety of different ways. Now, thinking about that combination of how we scale back increases in economic activity and how we promote some more of these commoning ideas, it seems to me that there's a useful distinction to be made between planning with post-growth and planning for post-growth. Now, by planning with post-growth, I mean planning in post-growth contexts. That means planning in situations where growth is not apparent and is difficult to generate and it seems to have gone away. And by planning for post-growth, I mean more proactively building the agenda, which leads possibly towards degrowth. Now, a lot of my work isn't in the former area. It's about how we can plan with post-growth in contexts where growth is not a realistic possibility. And my chapter in the book highlights the fact that even in those contexts, contemporary planning tends to pursue a very particular vision of market-led growth. So it's quite difficult for planners to accept that they are often in situations where the market-led growth options just don't work, and they need some alternatives, but those alternatives are missing at the moment. So what I think one needs to do is build the toolkit of how to do planning without growth and how to match that toolkit to very specific contexts. Because without that, planners actually have very little they can offer to localities and to communities. And by that, I mean both residential and business communities as well. So I'm currently looking at a whole variety of different ways of, might be considered common in community-based housing development, community-based energy, community-based greening, community-based business in terms of focusing more on local businesses and really interrogating what the role of planning could be in order to both deliver more environmentally sustainable options as well as increase quality of life and livelihoods for people in those areas. But I think many of the issues that Federico has raised has been fall more in the second camp. That's planning for post-growth. How do we build it as a broader agenda and how to make it work? And what I'd like to do is just raise 4 difficult questions that I still have whenever I address this issue of planning for post-growth and how it moves towards the degrowth agenda. First, there is the question of how inequitable distribution of goods and services, labour market opportunities, income and wealth can be resolved. Politically, growth has been used as a way of avoiding redistribution. It relies on a growing pie that everyone somehow can get a share of. So how do we actually respond to the absence of this possibility pragmatically? You know, given we don't have political systems that for various electoral reasons and ideological reasons that are strongly pro-redistribution. And I think we need to recognize the world that we currently live in. Do we incorporate the idea that some areas can grow in order to increase living standards of people in those areas? Does that go alongside actually decreasing the levels of production and consumption in others? Do we need some kind of national or regional accounts to manage that process of growth and degrowth and the spatial patterns of growth and degrowth? My second question is one that Federico's touched on, is about public services and how they're financed. Public services currently rely on market-based economic activity for funding through taxation and other forms of raking off profitability. Given that post-growth thinking doesn't necessarily imply an absolute reduction in the scale of economic activity, one can assume that the fiscal base might remain much the same and that public spending could therefore be maintained. But what about improvements in public services and investments for the future? Are they under financial threat? How do we actually raise the resources in order to actually make the public finances of a post-growth scenario work? The third one is a question mark I have over whether constraints on the scale of economic activity will enable a transition to a less resource-intensive and less polluting form of production and distribution of goods and services. This transition needs new ways of doing things, including new forms of infrastructure and the built environment, something that planning is very focused on. As Federico said, currently the gains in resource efficiency seem to be largely offset by the increasing scale of economic activity. Delinking doesn't seem to work. The rebound effect is everywhere. So how can we enable the transition that we want towards more environmentally acceptable ways of doing things at the same time as shifting towards, say, a steady state economy? Investment under market conditions is often predicated on outcomes of growth. In a sense, that's the promise that funds investment. So how do we foster investment in the transition without the promise of growth? What are the financial mechanisms that we need to do that? And fourth and finally, and turning to the role of commoning, I wonder whether commoning solutions have the capacity to scale up sufficiently to meet people's needs for goods and services. There is a tendency to assume that bottom-up or community-based initiatives are self-generating, self-maintaining. There's been a lot of research done on this, and it's very clear two things. Firstly, that they require new institutional frameworks and funding to facilitate them, establishment and spread. That possibly I can imagine, happening. But in addition, it has to be recognized that commoning placed a lot of demands on civil society in a locality, and specifically on particular people within civil society. And so many studies of commoning activities refer to burnout and problems, what happens when people get older and how you reinvigorate sort of involvement and such. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done on how best to enable and sustain commoning in practice. So my hope is that the shift to post-growth thinking will open up research and debate within planning on both these angles, on planning with post-growth conditions, but also on these complexities of planning for post-growth. I really welcome the volume edited by Federico and his co-editors, and I think it really is a big step in taking this forward. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Yvonne. Indeed, a perspective which considers instruments as a way of understanding how to govern the transitions of a change or whatever kind of direction we want to give to the future. It's an absolutely crucial perspective. And in political science as well, this is going on very much also with some colleagues and friends of us, with the governing through policy instruments in Sciences Po with Patrick Legales, Pierre Lescouz, and others. Elisabetta, it's your turn to comment.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much, Federico, for your very detailed presentation. And as you aptly summarize in your presentation, the book advancing theories, as well as it showcases actual concrete examples of practices ranging from dwelling to transport and governing. And these practices hinge on the principle of degrowth or post-growth, rather. And I think that the book is very interesting and it succeeds in emphasizing the role of urban and small-scale initiatives in building a post-growth society. And indeed, as mentioned in the presentation, cities are dissipative systems, but at the same time, they may be the key to change the centrality of economic growth in planning as well as in policy making. Going much more in detail into the chapters, I think that there was a word in the foreword and in introduction that caught my attention, and this word was imaginaries. So some author explained that there are post-growth imaginaries, and this term hints at how post-growth is not yet embedded in planning and in governing practices. So one may ask how far or how close we are to realize post-growth society. And this question is particularly salient if we consider that on a daily basis, we can see how individuals' behavior, as well as institutional decisions, run counter post-growth principles. Therefore, I wonder whether these practices are only a drop in the ocean, that is a small number of degrowth or post-growth practices, and unfortunately, these are offset by an overwhelming amount of consumerist pro-growth behaviors and decision-making if we are looking at the institutional side. As you mentioned in the presentation, the book will present examples, proposals on how to make planning practices more post-growth oriented. And personally, and because I believe that the issue of governing is crucial to unleash a post-growth society, I read with very much interest and curiosity the two chapters of the governing section. And I do share that we need a polycentric system, which a diffused kind of governance model, and especially a multi-level governance in place. Although the term governance is kind of harshly criticized by one of the chapters as a sort of a neoliberal way to describe a hybrid system where different actors participate in policy making, and where often actually citizens are not properly involved in decision making. And also, what it is important to have a sort of subsidiarity principle well and properly implemented, where actually subsidiarity is not just a way for higher levels of authority to offload the responsibility to the lower levels. So actually, where a system where the local level, regional level get responsibilities as well as resources from the upper level. And at the same time, like the authors of these two chapters, I believe that cities may acquire a prominent role in incentivizing citizens, in participating with ideas and practices to deliver a post-growth society. And cities can also help citizens empower themselves. In relation to these chapters, I think that in one of those, in both of them actually, the word commoning was a recurring word, and also Yvonne mentioned it. And this is really important because the concept of commoning is really at the heart of post-growth and degrowth theory. So it's not surprising that the authors relied on this concept in building up their chapters. It is really interesting, the fact that one of the chapters used the idea of the city as a common in itself. And what is really interesting, especially in chapter 7, is the fact that the author puts forward the idea to organize a diffuse form of governance that still ensures the different practices of care are coordinated. So in such a view, the state is identified as a system of holons with a range of functional organization that has to be built from the bottom up. So the proposal from a theoretical point of view relies on the viable system model, which foresees systems as autonomous and autopoietic. So accordingly, we should create layers of meta-management, which permits distributed operational nodes to control day-to-day decision. Now, I do believe that this theory and the author's thesis are fascinating from an intellectual standpoint. However, I do wonder to what extent this proposal is viable, which seems a bit of a contradiction, but and also how we can start building this system of autonomous and autopoietic subsystem. And in particular, one may wonder who is going to implement it. So the institutions in place, new institutions, present communities, different communities. So it is not really clear in that sense. And in the same vein, chapter 8, which is always part of the governing section, adopts a critical perspective, as I said before, about the concept of governance. And again, the author underscores the importance in post-growth theory and practices of urban commons. And in particular, he talks about commons governance, which is understood as a particular form of collective management and action. So in a nutshell, in the same space, there might be a theater, cinema, craft, workshop, co-working spaces, even a musical community center. So many functions in a unique place. And to do so, for the authors, is necessary to hack the law in order to pave the way to self-government and people's empowerment. So in these chapters, changes in the legal framework are demanded so as to incorporate commons and commons governance in the legal system. So basically, from an institutional legal perspective, in order to unleash a post-growth society, we need to have legal hackers, which should take on the role of role changer. And again, I think that this chapter raises some questions about the actual feasibility of the proposal put forward, and more importantly, the scope, or rather the transformative capacity of the practice of legal hacking for the governance of commons. And I'm going to conclude my intervention by saying a few words about the final part of the book, which includes a very interesting manifesto for post-growth planning, which indicates what planners and institutions should or could do to deliver a more environmental friendly and fairer society. It is a prescriptive part which offers interesting insights and suggestions about how things should change. And again, I have some questions about it, and in particular, how will these radical changes be initiated? And more importantly, how will they be diffused in other places? So it's not just an issue of scaling up, but also of spreading the post-growth word in a sense. And how will post-growth advocates persuade power holders and citizens about the need to unleash these changes? Because as I mentioned before, in the real world, we see that consumerism, capitalism are still regulating much of the social lives as well as political institutions. So I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to Federico's response.
Thanks a lot, Elisabetta, for your thought-provoking questions and comments also. I would give the floor to Federico for a first reaction. There have been many issues on the table, so Federico, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very thankful for Yvonne and Elisabetta for engaging with the book. I really appreciate it, and it's an honor to have your time, to really think about these issues. I noted a bit the questions, so I will try to answer to all of them, and I apologize if I missed something. To Yvonne, so the first issue that she brings forward is this distinction, which I like very much, about between planning with post-growth or planning for post-growth. So in fact, the claim of post-growth planning is somehow very simple. On the one hand, we do need to increase quality of life, amenities, public facilities and services where there is not enough. So this is a clear project of improvement in some areas which have been in fact marginalized by the centripetal economic growth model that we have. These are peripheral areas, often smaller villages, smaller towns in regions which tend to attract capital, goods, and people. There, obviously, in as much as in the global south, the project is to increase the quality of life of most of the people. However, the degrowth story is, the degrowth argument is that we can never do that within the planetary boundaries if we don't consider the option of downscaling where there is excess. So in fact, the redistribution is essential there. We need to take from all kinds of non-necessary productions, take basically resources from there and put them where there are all kinds of necessary productions needed. Now, when this is clearly the question how to pay for these services. If we look at how we manage cities and city finances today, we see that many of the public money are actually being thrown away to promote economic growth. We in fact, governments waste tons of monies in producing retail areas, in high, international business districts, airport extensions, high-speed train extensions in areas where, all kind of infrastructural investments need to follow up. We see that these investments are actually motivated by the idea that indeed, by investing in this economic growth, then there will be some trickle-down effect to pay for services. Well, the argument of a post-growth planning would be to stop doing those kind of investments, in fact, and investing directly those same money, or even just a fraction of those same money, in essential services. Let me give you an example. In Amsterdam, we have the South Axis, it's a big business district. It's been developed by the state and the city together. There were 3 billion euros put there. And what happens there is that there are 4,000 billion euros coming in every year and 4,000 billion euros coming out every year. While the actual economic output of that area, it's for the city, it's minimal. The same works with the airport. The airport of Amsterdam has been a massive investment site for the state and the city, but we know very clearly that in fact most of the flights are exchange flights. They bring no added value to the city region of Amsterdam. So there is this idea that investing in these massive infrastructures with public money will deliver in public value. Well, the argument here would be to in fact stop this vicious thinking and invest directly in those services where they are needed. So we do need a policy of care, well-being, health, education, green space, and regeneration in cities, which is the priority, not the proxy of these investments. So this means also that systems of value capturing and tools that we have in place could be useful, but might be in fact redundant in as much as we start in fact taxing excess. For example, other examples would be to have a progressive tax or underuse of space. In the city where I live, nowadays, every single homeowner pays 0.5% of the cadastral value of the house, independently from the use ratio of the space. So I pay the amount of money, the same percentage of somebody owning a house which is 5 times larger of mine, and with less people in it, using it for less time. There is no reason for this. We could disincentivize underuse of space, increasing progressive taxation, so of penalizing underuse of space, second, third homes, underused homes, and takes those money to bring take down those money to invest in services where they are needed. So I think degrowth focus on excess to take resources to invest in services. The same work for waste, for example. We could modulate much better taxes on waste in cities. Nowadays, there is only two levels, usually 1 person, 2 persons. There is no whatsoever a way to modulate taxes on waste based on actual waste produced. That's one of the main problems. Now, this is what I would answer to these questions. An agenda that brings in indeed back the need-based economy and that invest in activities that are much less polluting and much more important. Now, the issue of commoning is bring both of the discussants. I agree, commoning is central to the degrowth debate. The reason why it is central is that on the one hand, it's obviously clear that the market-led mechanism, the trickle-down economics, is not delivering neither in social or ecological targets. On the other hand, degrowth is also rooted in the autonomous tradition of critical thought that also rejects the state as, in fact, one of the hands of capital. So commoning brings back the issue of autonomy also from the state. Now here I have a bit more ambivalent opinion, because what we see in fact that the successful practices of commoning in housing, in urban agriculture, in mobility in cities are actually successful because there were regulations in place that protected those commoning practices. So in fact, the chapter of Massimo De Angelis and Giuseppe Micciarelli, which Elisabetta mentioned, they clearly say we need to create those conditions that allows those commoning practices to thrive. The case of Naples, brought by Giuseppe Micciarelli, which uses the term of hacking the law, it's one of the most interesting in Europe. There was a law promulgated by the mayor of the city of Naples. It's a law so-called on civic usages, which actually set clearly a model of delegating communities to manage underused public facilities for cultural purposes. This law was promulgated by the mayor and enacted the commoning of those spaces. So I do believe that public administration need to invest more in this type of regulations, which allow to, in fact, delegate communities to self-organize and self-manage those spaces. Now, the questions that Elisabetta brings forward of feasibility and viability is one of the most commonly posed questions whenever we talk about degrowth. I understand. The answer to that question, let's say, there are two answers. The first is not a nice answer. It basically says that the alternative is non-viable from a climate and social justice perspective. So we do need to consider degrowth as a viable alternative, but that doesn't help much, I agree. The other answer is that the viability and feasibility of this proposal obviously rests upon the strength of socio-political movements for degrowth in cities. So I do think that degrowth is a project that requires a massive mobilization around the target of meeting, arresting climate breakdown and achieving social justice. The movements that are today supporting degrowth are indeed going into this direction, and we need to nurture them and take them extremely seriously. And these movements do build on two types of activities. One is prefiguration, so practicing the future, the examples that Elisabetta also mentioned of commoning. This is a way of prefiguration. But the other is pressure, so direct action in order to pressure institutions to change the regulatory conditions. So I think now is a time where also a degrowth can become a meaning for existing social and environmental movements that are active on the ground every day. And this is what's happening in Barcelona, for example, where degrowth has given meaning to existing municipalist movements, and today is doing that very well. It's happening also in Amsterdam, where post-growth and donut economics is motivating social and ecological movements. And I think it's happening also at the national level, where we see degrowth becoming now, let's say, a meaningful term for ecological justice movements. So I think this is the way basically to trigger institutional change that at the moment it's an important avenue to take into consideration. I don't know if I answered all the questions, but maybe it's good to leave it here and allow for other questions from the audience. I could go on forever, as you know, Yuri, on this, but I leave it to you.
Thanks a lot for your reactions to these questions. The questions were not always easy to address because they go deep into the epistemology of the issues at stake. But I think we can address other questions, and through these other questions, we might address these issues more thoroughly. There is a question in the chat, and I urge others also to ask questions both in the chat or raising their own hand, and then I give you the word to ask the question in the room, in the Zoom room. So I read out the question loud so that everybody can hear it, and also it's recorded. So could you consider degrowth as an economic system equivalent to capitalism, ? Or how would you define the relationship between the two, ? The question has been asked by Oriane. I don't know how to pronounce it, like use, probably, I don't know. Okay.
Yeah, very good. Of course, I can address the issue of capitalism. Degrowth is obviously, or let's say non-explicitly, but clearly an anti-capitalist agenda. And it is anti-capitalist because capitalism is a system that survives out of expansion. So it is this compulsive, what Marx called mute compulsion to expand, that in fact characterizes the capitalist system. So it is the antithesis of steady state economics, and it is the antithesis of degrowth. As far as we question expansion, we are being basically anti-capitalist to a certain degree. Now, of course, the expansion is at the expenses of labor and nature. That's the two ways in which capitalism bring about expansion. So degrowth is a project that focuses on labor and nature, on the justice of these two terms. However, what is very important also to say is that degrowth is also not a classic communist or socialist project. It's very clear that an alternative to capitalism, a system where production is socialized, it's also not compatible with the environment. The recent book by Saito, Marx and the Anthropocene, very nice book, clearly shows that also the neoclassical approach to anti-capitalism is not enough. So in fact, there, the argument is that of degrowth is that we need to organize our society in a way in which, A, we produce as much as possible only what is necessary to the well-being of humans. So we focus on that. And B, we find way, and this is interesting, we find creative and socialized way to waste, in fact, all that surplus that should not be brought back into the capitalist cycle. This is a very important term and is usually referred as the term of dépense. So the idea of wasting or somehow gifting out surplus in order to not reinvest it in the circle. And that's why, in fact, alternative forms of hedonism are crucial for degrowth. Finding way to find pleasure and spending your surplus time, for example, in ways that are not capitalistic. So, eroticism, music, art, culture, these are the type of things that degrowth cultural scholars bring about. So it is an anti-capitalist and an anti-productivist project, degrowth. Why? So this was the question, and I understand, right? I hope I answer it. What I would like to say also is that degrowth is not a preconceived state of things. They also try to avoid giving a picture of how things would look like. This is also why, as a planner, I tend to not just list what degrowth things should be, like bikes, shared mobility, public transports. I try to not make these lists because, in fact, it's about the principles of how we govern social spatial relationships. And I think we should think in those terms. And the key principle there is sufficiency, satiation. That should be, in fact, one of the key driving principles, which it's the opposite of capitalism and the opposite of productivist communism, I would say.
Thanks a lot, Federico. We have two questions. I would first give the floor to Brice, and then there is a question from the Four Cities program, which is a master program. Probably you all know it, including Madrid, Brussels, Vienna, and I think Copenhagen, if I remember well. Brice, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for this presentation, and also the whole background information you gave at the beginning on why this is such an urgent matter. My question, you mentioned the importance of social movements and how social movements, and also that post-growth planning goes beyond how we produce on a material level, but how more I understand with the importance of how we live together. So how we live together. And so you mentioned this concept of prefiguration in social movements, and I wondered how can we, because basically what social movements do, that tend to adopt this kind of post-growth approach. When they do prefiguration, they, for example, take a place and they live together and they do trial and error, right? So they try to make social relations not only a way to achieve their goals, but they achieve their goals by doing them. So they have to do trial and error. So it's an iterative process. But when you do planning, you can't plan a city as an iterative process, right? I mean, I guess you can, but you have also things that are like architecture and public transportation and such things that you can't just say, okay, we are going to do another assembly with the local people, and maybe next week we change how we approach this. So I wondered how much of a problem is this for post-growth approach or degrowth approach to planning?
Yeah, thank you, Brice. I agree. This is actually a key debate within degrowth, especially between the most state-oriented voices and the most anarchist voices. Somehow, some say, we need to open up to autonomous spaces as much as possible, and prefiguration is one way to do it. And if we do that, we will be able to govern the city as a complex system. But actually, others say, as you point out, that, well, no, we do need some degree of institutional and regulatory oversight that allows, in fact, to provide essential collective services and leave them there for everybody. And I think this is a bit of a typical discussion within the left, between folk politics and state politics. I think what the answer there should be: we do need to orient existing institutions to the well-being of humans and the environment. That means we can use what is in place now to nurture that, to create the infrastructural conditions to nurture the well-being of humans and the environment. If we do that, we know that we will already stop and downscale and divest from all kinds of stuff that is actually not bringing well-being for humans and environment. I mean, frequent flyer or fossil fuel storage being the first thing, and we will invest in activities that are proven to be extremely essential for well-being: schools, education, kindergarten, green, and public transport and housing being the first. So if we already shift the attention, the public attention, to these qualities, we will already have solved many of the problems. Now, once we do that, we should not do it in a status top-down way. But as Yvonne already pointed out, this is not going to happen. We're already far beyond that stage. So there is no risk there. What instead we have to gain is the possibility, in fact, to create and to nurture activities that are already somehow positively functional to deliver those basic goods. And this is what's happening in cases of cities where cities directly address well-being. They basically immediately build upon existing practices, common practices that are delivering on well-being. The case of Barcelona is an example where, for example, the anti-eviction movement has become extremely central in dealing with housing issues next to the public administration. I think as far as the public shift to well-being, there will be also space for these commoning autonomous practices to thrive, exactly because we do not have a strong state that is coming back in the way the traditional socialist image might suggest. Well, there are some countries where this is more the case, of course, but I do think that the risk it's low there. So, yeah, I would start, commoning and making public key essential services in cities and see what happens. That's what I would start, rather than starting from the debate of whether we need the whole state or not. That's how I would advise urban policymakers to deal with this issue.
Thanks a lot, Federico. We have a very practical question in the chat. I read it loud. It's from the members of the 4 Cities program. What might degrowth look like on the individual civic level? How can everyday people practice degrowth?
Very good, yeah. So I think there are 3, let's take a simplistic way of how degrowth would look like. Let's divide people in 3 groups: the poor, the middle classes, and the rich. And I know it's very simplistic, but more or less we can use that, I think. It's clearly the case that the lifestyle of the ultra wealthy individuals within degrowth will downscale. That means that they will not suffer dramatic health and personal concerns, but they will have to give away some of the key things that become crucial for their supposedly, let's say, supposed happiness. Again, SUVs, private jets, private yacht, luxury goods, art in storage facilities, all these things, they need to be tackled. We need to, in fact, tackle that in order to generate revenues. So for the rich, the story is not good. For the poor people, the people who don't meet basic standards, I think there will be all to gain. For example, if we implement serious or universal basic incomes, right? If we implement universal basic income systems within space, so universal basic spatial income, so in terms of public space in areas and green and public facilities and public transport, if we implement services to individual well-being, like kindergarten, care for elderly, care for disabled people, we will know that the life quality of these people will improve. Moreover, we will know that the compulsion to work and debt will also improve. So in fact, for those groups, degrowth is a project of liberation and improvement of quality of life. And this is very important for the politicians. This needs to be conveyed very clearly. And then we have the middle classes, the image that I showed already in my presentation. We have a sector of the population which is already somehow conscious of their green concern, of their environmental impact. They are trying actively to reduce it, but somehow they still keep a relatively high environmental impact. I think there, the degrowth project is a project that will in fact bring back some quality of life, especially in relation to work and free time. It will, they will practice degrowth by downscaling particular types of consumption which are environmentally impactful. And at the same time, they will also gain in the space that is given, in fact, by universal public services. By this group, it's more difficult to picture, but what I think is that in this type of social groups, what is actually missing nowadays often, it's time, it's pleasure in work. And these are things that degrowth is trying to bring back. Time, pleasure at work, personal pleasure, alternative hedonism, things that makes you feel good. And I think for this type of social group, the story should focus on those aspects, because there we know that their basic needs are usually met. Now, there is a small disclaimer. There is two things that we do need to stop and tax massively. One is meat consumption and production. We know that is the #1 reason for ecological destruction is our farming system, as George Monbiot and others have already pointed out. So that needs to change. And the second is flying. So flying needs to be much more expensive and needs to provide revenues to invest in railway systems. So these two things are things that everybody from poor to rich will have to downscale. But I think this will come probably in 20 years when we will have a clear climate crisis in our doors. Then even in the global north, in Europe, then these things will come, but will come under the form of imposed regulations, and we don't want that. We should prevent it.
Thanks a lot, Federico. There is a quick comment in the chat and then another question. So, viva la degrowth revolution. 4Cities loves degrowth. We love this presentation, and we'd also love to meet your cat if you have time. Thank you all. That was the comment.
Okay, thank you.
And the question is, do you think it is inevitable to implement degrowth practices top-down on a large scale for rules and law?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Brice also asked. I think there would be a combination of regulatory changes, motivated also by pressure, by movements to the state, and giving space to practices of commoning and prefigurations on the ground. I think it will be a combination of two. However, now is essential to divest and redirect resources from a fossil economy to a well-being economy. So this has to be done by coordinated state action, which will invest regulations which will indeed shift productive capacities from less necessary to necessary forms of production. I think it would be naive to not imagine this shift at the moment, especially because we need it fast at a fast pace in order to deal with the climate breakdown. is it this top down? I think it's just how it works. In the sense that there are, states setting up boundaries, minimum and maximum standards for cities and for regions every day. If we take, social housing percentage in development project, if we take, renewable energy amounts, minimum amounts generated per region, these are basically state-driven frameworks. Nowadays, the European Union is considering a no net land take policy, which is going to explode in the public debate very soon. This is also clearly a state-driven policy. Basically, the obligation for city regions to de-seal or de-seal land every time they extend urban sprawl. This is extremely important regulations that will contain somehow the compulsion to growth of cities. So yeah, I think these are these top down? Yes, they are top down, but this is how our institutional system works at the moment, with a combination of top down and bottom up. Yeah, that's how I would answer to that comment.
That's indeed a very interesting issue, which also struggled me a lot because I'm very sympathetic with all that has been discussed so far, but I also see a potential source of inequality in commoning, in going local, in having wonderful pilots, socially innovative initiatives. I'm not an expert on the degrowth debate, but I worked quite a lot on social innovation and social policy. And indeed, social policy started very local, it started in a factory, when it were trade unions, they were claiming for their rights, and then rights were given, etc., and then it scaled up somehow. And if it doesn't scale up, it might produce or reproduce or consolidate quite an unequal access to this kind of commoning potentially resources available. I don't know what you think about that. So I think your answer, it's a mix of both, and also Yvonne's comment before about the enabling legislature and the role of framing the whole process in a specific way, I think plays a very crucial role in directing, with the pressure of bottom-up movements. That's definitely a very important point. But what are they claiming? They're claiming for a specific kind of regulation, for specific rights, and these rights are produced by parliaments at national levels or by international agreements. So there is somehow a multi-level governance, whatever, combination of actors and levels which need to collaborate in one specific direction to have goals achieved. Otherwise, it's more difficult. Okay, we have a few other actually questions. One is by Guillen. Is there any discussion of a strategic, measurable, that's an important point, and global Marshall Plan for degrowth, post-growth, that is synchronized to the urgent time frame of a 1.5 degrees C climate clock, which is approximately 6 years to stay within the 1.5 carbon budget. We are wasting 1% of our carbon budget every month. If we don't focus a minimum amount of energy on the short-term threat, the long-term work may not matter much if planetary tipping points are breached. Yeah,
I agree. It is, if we look at the climate science, the situation is pretty worrisome. In fact, we do have very short window of opportunity, in fact, to have a rapid and massive downscaling of our material footprint, and in particular CO2 and greenhouse gases emissions. This is the reason why I think there is a beginning of awareness among mainstream politicians and even economists, in fact, that the current hopefulness of geoengineering and climate mitigation would not will not deliver at the speed and scale that is necessary. And that's why, for the first time, actually, in the IPCC report published last year, the degrowth terms comes 30 times as one clear alternative. Now, many would think degrowth is not a quick fix either. But I do think that as soon as we embrace a post-growth thinking, we do bring in the picture some key issues that were left out, like indeed heavily divesting or divesting from environmentally destructive mode of production and consumption. So that's what degrowth does, brings back into the picture some key issues that were no topic before, like frequent flyer, SUVs, or luxury goods, excessive space consumption, things like this, land consumption, things like this. So yeah, well, it's we need to try. I mean, it's our responsibility to try to bring in this change in a rapid fashion, and that's why I think the dialogue with movements now active in this field is essential for degrowth. Degrowth is something that stimulates movements and kind of puts them into synergy with public administrations. Now, the Marshall Plan, there is not really a Marshall Plan, and I think nobody would claim that is a good idea. But what economists have started doing, like Julian Steinbergen, for example, have started doing, they started to list the so-called the so-called standards of decent living that should be taken as a reference point for a truly environmental taxation and progressive taxation. They, for example, calculated, and this is relevant for urban scholars a lot, they calculated that everybody in the planet would live well within planetary boundaries if we would have about 20 square meters of space in our houses per person. So if we take that as a indication, then we can modulate taxation on underuse of space based on that indicators. For example, cities could imagine taxing at a higher percentage every house that uses more than those 20 square meters per person. So that means that we could detax families of 4 living in 80 square meters. We could actually detax that, but we could double the taxation on family of 4 living in 160 or more square meters. This type of calculations are helpful, I think, to understand what could be a target. The same works for mobility. For example, they calculated that we could well live in planetary boundaries worldwide if we would travel 4,000 kilometers per year. Now, that means that if we take an intercontinental flight, we're already above our budget. And that's why those kind of flights should be heavily taxed. Yet, if you travel much less than 4,000 kilometers, then you should actually be compensated. You're actually living within planetary boundaries. You should not be taxed if you commute to work 20 minutes a day, because you are definitely within those 4,000 kilometers per year. So what I'm saying again is that these calculations, which are coming from economics, based on the idea of decent living standards, could inform planning policies in a way that is socially, ecologically just. So we could take those and really think in terms of how we modulate our taxation system, our standard system in development, our value capturing mechanisms. I think these are all tools that we can use to have a more fair and ethical system in a situation of climate breakdown. So it's not a Marshall Plan, but it's kind of they give a guideline, I guess.
I will combine the two next questions. So the first one is a comment and question. How can we implement measures that you mentioned, so anti-capitalist practices within capitalist states? And the next question is by Aristides Papas, and the previous one was by Dennis Marx. Degrowth is a rather radical and disruptive concept, and this raises a variety of concerns regarding its exploitation and use by governments and political regimes. So what is your point of view as a side effect? how can we thwart constitutions and stakeholders from deploying degrowth to accomplish their self-interests?
Yeah. Now, they are both questions point at the same problem: the fact that capitalism, and in particularly growth-oriented economies, they have a fantastic capacity to co-opt terms that are bringing social ecological justice. They are very resilient in that. The reason they did that with the sustainability term, for sure. And that's why I am a big fan of the degrowth term, because the D before makes it already less prone to cooptation. It's already much harder to use the term degrowth within a marketing strategy, selling you, some useless shit. Let's put it this way. So that's why I think degrowth is already a better term than others. So that's the first. How do we do that? I think actually in one of my writings that I cited in my presentation, that is called Maintaining Autonomy, and it's about where I study housing commons and how they survive in a capitalist system. There I show that the theory says that the only way for commoning practices, so anti-capitalist practices, to survive is to actually reproduce. It's a bit of a paradox, but basically, as far as they stay in their space in a static way, they do not survive. They tend to be marginalized. So the only way is to create synergies and links between all kind of other commoning practices. So I think this is the only way for this practice to resist cooptation mechanism, is to join forces with other commoning practices and building up movements across them. If they do that, they will manage. And one of the cases I give is the Mietshäuser Syndikat in Germany. I'm really sorry for the pronunciation, but this Mietshäuser Syndikat is basically a federation of housing cooperatives. It's a cooperative that reunites hundreds of housing cooperatives in the country and protects them against the market mechanism. In fact, what happens there is that cooperatives delegate half of their management to a higher level cooperative, of which they are members, in order to avoid that those cooperatives will be eventually privatized and financialized. The same system exists in Austria, is coming up in the Netherlands. This is one way, for example, to create a federational system of commoning that protects these practices from the pressure of the capitalist state. But I think still using the term degrowth would be already also another help in this endeavor.
Yes, thank you. I don't know if you have seen this debate by Pankhauser and Hickel, and some of them were arguing, why do you use degrowth? This is so depressing because growth is nice, is wealth, is whatever, and degrowth gives an image of poverty and things like that. Yeah. Do you think that a strategic use of another term would gain more support from a rhetorical point of view within the masses? Because that's a very elitarian approach. People have to know about that, have to know a lot of, have to have information, have to have a mindset, etc., etc. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I agree. So the answer to that thing is, I have two answers to that question usually. The first is the academic answer. So this is what is necessary, is to downscale our economy. It's a bit like a person that is obese, has high cholesterol, goes to the cardiologist. The cardiologist says, you have high cholesterol, you need to stop your cholesterol intake. And the guy obese says, oh, why are you so negative? Well, this is what the academics are saying. Yes, it's bad. You need to stop your cholesterol intake. You need to get a diet. Then if you want, you can go to a nutritionist and they will give you the gentle way to tell you the same and help you doing that. But the cardiologist is very clear on that point. Anyway, there's a metaphor that I use to explain the fact that as an academic, I have the responsibility to tell what it should be done. And this is a downscaling of the economy and a slowing down of the economy and a closing loops of the economy. Now, of course, I am an academic and I don't pretend to be a politician. So there is also a job for politicians and political leaders to actually take those informations and translate that into a narrative that would appeal the wider electorate. This is a process of popularization, which academics are notably bad at doing. But still, I think it's very important to take it seriously. As an academic, I have a responsibility to inform politicians on what degrowth means. Now, of course, if they find an alternative word that works to convey the same message, they are very welcome. There is no reason to stick to the word degrowth. I'm not earning money with my books, you know. And the point is, this is a job for politicians, and I think some are taking that on board. I think what my suggestion is for green left parties is to couple ecological targets to social targets. So the degrowth story is, we are going to bring back the economy to the planet, and by doing that, we're going to take from the rich and bring back to the poor. And by doing that, we bring back not only essential services, but also we create time, free time, because now people are overworked, they are massively exploited. So the challenge of a politician is to convey that message that is a social ecological justice project. Again, I'm not a politician, but I'm happy to help them. And I'm happy to help planners and city makers.
Well, actually, you provided already part of a potential answer in the sense that you cited a lot of studies that decoupled GDP growth from happiness. So instead of having happiness, not happiness, but just material growth, you should increase happiness. And that should be the message. Increase happiness rather than growth. That's the alternative. I think many would subscribe to that. But we have a few other questions before we close down. So as you said, the need to limit growth is especially relevant for the upper part of the rich. How do you see the distinction between it's the time and place for degrowth here, and it's not so much needed here? Do you think it should be applied worldwide? That's, of course, a question about global north, global south, or geospatial inequalities across the world.
So basically, if I understand correctly, it's a question about degrowth in the global south, or at least for the groups that are today marginalized, exploited by the current system. Yeah.
This is how I interpret the question, but I don't know if Adan wants to make it more precise, but you can go on answering this, yes.
I think it's a very fair question, and well, the answer that I give is the same that Hegel and many others that studied this unequal exchange between global north and global south have answered. Degrowth is a project of downscaling excess, so we need to start from where that excess is concentrated. Nobody is claiming for a degrowth of poorer social groups. But what I showed in my slide is that we see now that the inequality is also within global south. So also there we see there is an accumulation of excess emissions relative to within the highest percentile, our highest income groups. So degrowth there can be useful terms also for socio-ecological redistribution. Of course, if we take per capita emissions, and that's very important, then we know that within the global south, we're still almost within the allowed CO2 emissions per year. So degrowth is not a priority there. And I think if we want to move away from the developmental approach that has somehow invested current global politics, we could also start saying, okay, we have to degrowth where first in the global north, and by doing that, we also break the dependency that the global south has on the global north. Degrowth here means also that the amount of stuff and goods that is produced in the global south for the global north will also be decreased. And then we can open up spaces of more context-specific developments in those sites. So I think breaking the dependency of the global south from the growth of the global north is the project of degrowth in the global north. So that's what I would answer to the question. But yes, I think we should start where we can first, and we should start where it is necessary to start. instead of worrying about how China or India will align to this project. So that's what would be my answer to that question. Yes.
Okay, so far there are no questions anymore in the chat. I don't know if someone wants to raise his or her hand to ask something right now. Please, yes.
This is not so much a question, but more so just, I think, a comment that goes in your sense, and it's exactly what's at core. One of the 3 myths that that degrowth want to cut with. It's this idea that if the pie is getting bigger, then everyone is better off. And I think so. If we accept degrowth in the north, it doesn't mean that the South would suffer from this. This is exactly, I think, the core principle of what you mentioned as degrowth.
Sorry, Brice, I was disconnected exactly when you started the question, so I just got the last part. Can you repeat it briefly? Sorry.
I was just saying, I think what your argument is exactly what you mean as one of the myths of the growth logic. It's if we do degrowth in the north, obviously, it means we separate ourselves from this notion that if the pie is getting bigger, then it's better for everyone, because it's exactly, the pie is getting bigger only because it gets worse for some. So yeah, this is, I think, just complementary argument.
Yeah, I agree. It's breaking up the myth of trickle-down economics globally, basically. I think it's essential there. Still, it's not enough. I mean, of course, if China and India decide to have a very protectionist economy, completely inward-looking, then they will, and they can, with their amount of population and potential wealth to be generated, then we will still have a problem. But then we need to consider geopolitics. I mean, if the whole globe decides to degrow, then there will be few countries that might also, I mean, paradoxically, you don't do something that nobody else does in geopolitics. It becomes very hard. That's my, I mean, I'm speculating now, but yes.
There is one last question, because then we have to leave, but I think it's a nice way to finish. By Diane. These days, I'm using the term local north and local south to represent the inequality within local context. As Federico points out, there is a huge inequality in the global south as well. So it's not all one, of course. Every city has inequality. I work in the commons and think highly of it, but I'm also concerned, due to the huge and growing political polarization, how would you deal with potential polarization that would likely emerge in a growing post-growth common context? It has, think of implementing a common strategy in polarized United States.
Yeah,
Maine and Tennessee.
Yeah, no, I do think that the current system is geared to polarization. I mean, the fact that growth occurs under conditions of environmental disaster is exactly related to the fact that there are some groups that are racialized, marginalized, excluded from this process. It is just how this system works. So in fact, degrowth is an anti-polarizing term, but yes, it does shift the Overton windows. So it does anti-polarize by at the same time bringing back the bad side of things, or the bad guys. And I think this would come worse and worse. We will arrive to a point in which sea level rising, high temperature, we have such a massive effect on the broad population that frequent flying will be criminalized or will be looked as unethical. That's what we call, what, for example, George Monbiot called a techno-ethical shift. If we devise a system in which, for example, people are able to consume high quality food with low impact because proteins are produced in ways that are not environmentally harmful, then by consuming old-fashioned animal proteins will become unethical. So I assume that in a situation of dire need, there will be some shift in the ethical frames of reference that also inform the law. And that's how probably change will occur. We'll start, criminalizing some particular forms of environmental and social abuse that nowadays we don't criminalize. And I think in cities, especially if housing will become less affordable, if environmental requirements will become more strong, we will see that in fact massive underuse of space or excessive home ownership might become criminalized. And this is what happening, for example, in Berlin with the Deutsche Wohnen and Co. It was a process of criminalizing excess ownership in a city where affordability became an issue. We might imagine these trends also becoming, investing other sectors. And I think what's happening with frequent flying and private jets, it's also part of this trend. I think private jets, but also, I'm just digressing, but think about the amount of movies that today in the last 2-3 years are coming out that portrayed super rich as stupid, undecent people. Triangle of Sadness is one of the first, became so popular, and what is portraying is ultra wealth getting, swimming in their puke and getting completely impractical in their lifestyle. This is, I think this is a trend. We're seeing that ultra wealth is becoming somehow mocked, and in public media and culture, we see it happening, I think, a lot. So also what, Greta Thunberg did with this guy that was, eating pizza and then got caught. There are all these kind of situations in which we see that ultra wealthy are becoming somehow portrayed as a bad, not as an ideal to strive for. But this is not my field of research, but I see that happening more and more.
So viva la degrowth revolution, as someone said before. So thanks a lot, Federico. Thanks a lot, Yvonne. Thanks a lot, Elisabetta, for your comment and for every question you have asked. I think it was a very lively discussion, and a lot of issues have been put on the table, and I hope we can keep this discussion going on and even growing. This could grow, I would say. This discussion could grow. At least
thank you, Yuri, for organizing. And Brice, thank you very much.
And
thank
also
you, Yvonne and Elisabetta, for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
So,